Welcome to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine's podcast series. I'm Janet Hutchings, EQMM's editor. 2016 marks the 75th anniversary of EQMM, and in honor of that milestone, Columbia University's Butler Library recently hosted an afternoon-long symposium about the magazine's history, influence, fiction contributors, and art. We are going to be making both the audio and video recordings of the event available in segments, starting with this month's podcast of the introduction to the symposium and its first panel discussion, which was entitled Making Mystery Matter, Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and the Shaping of American Crime and Detective Fiction. The panelists, as introduced by Sean Quimby, the director of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Columbia University, are Charles Ardai, award-winning author and founding editor of Hardcase's Crime, well-known anthologist, critic, and fiction writer Sarah Weinman, doctoral candidate and literary scholar Leah Pennywark, and Jeffrey Marks, a leading biographer in the field of mystery and crime fiction. We expect to have the video for this segment of the program posted soon, and we urge you to check our website at www.themysteryplace.com/EQMM for updates on where it will be posted. Please note that there is a small amount of distortion at the beginning of this recording, but the sound quality improves greatly after just a few minutes.
Wow, this has to be the most disciplined group I've ever encountered. Normally I have to quiet people down before kicking things off. Good afternoon, and welcome to Columbia University's Butler Library, and to today's symposium celebrating the 75th anniversary of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. My name is Sean Quimby. I'm the director of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library here at Columbia, which is the home to Frederick Denne's papers and to the largest archive relating to EQMM. I hope I'm not committing some sin by saying EQMM, but it just seemed like way more efficient to do that over the next 10 minutes, so thank you. Some of you probably know there are some smaller collections at Yale, Beinecke Library, and at UCLA, but we're very pleased to hold an extensive collection comprising some 85 linear feet or 25,000 items. I'm not sure if either of those figures are easy to wrap my head around. And that includes correspondence with the likes of Agatha Christie, Raymond Chandler, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and Isaac Asimov, as well as manuscripts of stories by Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, William Faulkner, Jorge Luis Borges, and many others. You'll have the opportunity to see some of the treasures in the archive firsthand a bit later when we break for our reception at 6. Before I delve into the logistics and introductions, I'd like to let you know just how exciting it is for me to have the Ellery Queen archive here under my care. Prior to coming to Columbia in 2014, I spent 8 years at Syracuse University, where I oversaw the Street and Smith and Ace Books records, as well as the papers of Hugo Gernsback. Though I'm trained as a historian of technology, I found myself captivated by the research potential of archives relating to popular fiction. And yet, the more I read about the history of pulp magazines, which was really the strength there at Syracuse, the more frustrated I grew by literary scholars insisting on viewing them through the too narrow lens of the few literary giants who got their start in the pages of magazines like Amazing Stories, Weird Tales, or Black Mass. Sure, it's noteworthy that a 16-year-old Tennessee Williams published The Vengeance of Nitocris in the August 1928 issue of Weird Tales, but for the most part, the stories published in pulp magazines defy the methods of textual analysis and the phenomenon that was, and I guess continues to be, pulp. Says much more about the fragmentation and reintegration of media forms, stories, comic books, radio programs, and film. You'll see some of that in the exhibition a bit later. And about the nascent fan culture that they do about the greatness of any one author. I say that only because my friend Joyce Carol Oates is not here yet. So recent scholarship by people like Aaron Smith and David Earle raised new and interesting questions about the relationship of popular literature to gender and class identity and to literary modernism. Some of you may know those works. So if anything, pulp culture is very much alive today, But Ellery Queen's History magazine actually helped to kill the pulp magazine as a form. Published as a digest, as opposed to Pulp's very strict 7 by 10 inch size with 128 untrimmed pages, and with much higher editorial standards, EQMM represented the mystery form achieving a certain level of respectability. While sales of the pulp Black Mask had peaked in the 1930s, it ceased publication in 1951. Some of you may point out that it resurfaced in the 80s, which is true. So it's no accident that EQMM had its first hit the shelves in 1941, just soon after Black Mask had peaked. So while I'm not going to contest the literary superiority of EQMM over that which preceded it, I do want to call attention to the fact that one thing the formats do have in common is that readers have helped to shape the evolving genres of horror, science fiction, and detective fiction. Even in this age of social media, they continue to do so. So just as Weird Tale readers would argue over whether or not a particular tale was in fact weird enough, EQMM readers have their own online forums. Many of you probably have visited it, which is currently, by the way, it's currently experiencing some technological difficulties, I'm sorry to say. But it was a forum in which they were free to leave comments on just about any topic that interested them. All this is to say that I'd be remiss if we didn't take a moment to say thank you not just to the writers and editors and artists who will have with us today, but also to the fans and everyday consumers of EQMM. So thank you, fans. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to offer particular thanks to Janet Hutchings, the editor of and the coordinator of today's symposium, and she put an enormous amount of work into it. And to the aforementioned, I didn't actually mention Jenny Lee, I mentioned the exhibition, but Jenny Lee, standing in the back, is our curator for performing arts. And knows the archive as well as anyone. So she curated the exhibition that you'll see later. I'd also like to thank all of today's panelists and moderators. So appropriately enough, we're going to begin this afternoon with a panel that considers EQMM's role in shaping the mystery genre, and then move over to a discussion of cover art. Genre magazines, of course, are multimedia objects in their own right, which is something else that I took from my experience working with the pulp collection in Syracuse. And then the editorial process, and finally a reading by Joyce Carol Oates. Then Jenny will speak briefly on the exhibition. Janet will offer a few comments along with Peter Cantor. And then finally at 6, we'll head upstairs for a reception. When we do head upstairs, I want to make sure that you all know to use the elevator right out here on the east side and not on the west side, otherwise you'll find yourself lost in a warren of reading rooms. Anyways, we have a really busy day ahead of us, and I hope we have some rich and lively discussion in the course of it. So why don't we get started with our first panel called Making Mystery Matter. Our moderator is Charles Ardai, am I pronouncing it correctly?
You are indeed.
Ardai?
No, sorry.
You got it right the first time.
You are indeed.
I am indeed, Ardai.
Charles are indeed, yes.
I understand that you're a graduate of Columbia.
I am indeed.
We like that. He's a winner of the Edgar, Seamus, and Ellery Communal Awards, the author of novels such as Little Girl Lost, one of the writers and producers of the television series Haven, and the founding editor of Hard Case Crime, the acclaimed pulp fiction imprint that has published authors ranging from Stephen King and Michael Crichton to Mickey Spillane and Gore Vidal. His first professional fiction publication was in EQMM, and so now I turn things over to Charles, and he'll introduce you to the rest of our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a very exciting panel here today. Jeffrey Marks, Leah Pennywark, and Sarah Weinman. And I'm going to give you a few words about each, but we're going to get right into the meat of matters, so I'll speak quickly, but you're going to hear about their lives quickly. Jeffrey Marks is a longtime biographer with a specialization in the mystery field, including a biography of Craig Rice, which was called Who Was That Lady? That led to a book called Atomic Renaissance, Women Mystery Writers of the 1940s/1950s. And a biography of Anthony Boucher, surprisingly called Anthony Boucher. I say surprisingly because some people think it's Booker and some people say all sorts of things. Yes. Is it Boucher? It is. Very good. And he's currently working on a book on Ellery Queen. So it is not an accident that he is sitting at this table. Leah is a doctoral candidate at Purdue University and came in specially for this, courtesy of Purdue University's generosity. She specializes in 20th century American literature with a focus on detective fiction and postmodern literature. So Paul Auster must be in there somewhere.
Yes, he is.
Okay. Has published in LIT, Literature Interpretation Theory, and is finishing an article now on EQMM's impact on literary fiction in the mid-20th century. So that is a topic we will discuss. And Sarah Weinman, who I think everyone in the room knows, is the editor of Women Crime Writers, 8 suspense novels of the 1940s and 1950s, published by Library of America, which has gotten enormous critical acclaim and attention and deserves every bit of it. And Women Crime Writers, Stories from the Trailblazers of Domestic Suspense, published by Penguin. Her own short fiction has appeared in AHMM and EQMM, to use the acronyms mightily. And she's currently under contract to deliver a book, so the fact that she is sitting here instead of writing is something we will not tell her editor. The book is nonfiction on the subject of the actual case that inspired Lolita. So it is a book I very much look forward to reading. I assume it's going to be banned in many countries.
No comment?
No comment. We're going to try. So the influence. Why don't we start with you?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that 75 years on, looking back at the entirety of Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, we can just see how much it covers the entire scope of what we consider to be the mystery genre. I mean, I think of all the reprint stories that the magazine began with, and I hope that all of us can sort of discuss that a little bit at length too, how it transitioned from doing mostly reprints with a little bit of originals to largely originals with the choice reprint. And of course, the magazine was wonderful for discovering new writers with the Department of First Stories. It was wonderful, especially because it was such an interest of Fred Denay to do this, to find the mystery in every type of story. So he really believed, I'm going to paraphrase this, so I'm sure people will correct me on the exact quote, but he did believe that essentially every author of stature had produced a mystery story, and it was sort of his mission to seek them out, find them, and publish them. And of course, for my own specific interests, Ellery Queen was pivotal for producing Troubled Daughters, Twisted Wives. I think 9 of the 14 stories in that short story collection were taken from Ellery Queen because it was so good for psychological suspense. It was so good for publishing great women writers of the past. And I think just looking even to now, just the fact that you can find mystery stories that are tough and dark, but also on the lighter side, and they all coexist together. That is a real feat, and we really should commend EQMM for always having that vision and sticking with it.
Well, you mentioned kind of the movement from mostly reprints to mostly original. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is it was the 70s when the emphasis changed to almost all original stories. So from the time they started the Mystery Awards, which I think really changed the whole field in terms of the production of quality mystery short stories, to the end of the 60s, you have this really amazing blend where you do have Balzac next to Elaine Slater, next to Simon. You have you have a Fu Manchusical mixed in there, and a crime poem by Fitzgerald. And I think that period, for my work, is so interesting because it shows how central mystery really was for Cold War cultural narratives and kind of the way postmodernism developed out of it. So you see detective fiction and tropes and devices in all of those postmodern writers. I mean, Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49 is a detective story.
Yes. And he's always writing detective stories.
He's always
writing pulp stuff.
Yes.
So let's
He's
call
a
it what it
secret
is.
pulp fan.
Yeah.
Let's
A
be
secret?
honest.
I'd say not so secret.
I think not so secret after Inherent Vice.
Fair enough.
One of the things I wanted to talk about was just the.
Sure.
You got to eat the mic, Jack.
It's just the fact that when I'm studying the history of the genre, there are so many magazines that have come and gone after a few issues. The landscape's just littered with other authors who tried to imitate this and couldn't. I could just rattle on for the entire time. All the different magazines.
Mike Shane, Manhunt.
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
those lasted a little bit longer than some of
Yeah,
the
the
other
Saint
ones.
Mystery
Yes.
magazine. There were many.
Right.
Actually, Danny and Lee had one of their own that lasted only 4 issues, which was
Well, isn't that how they started in the first place?
Yes.
Which is that they did this
Mystery
for
Lee.
mystery. Yeah, I mean, you can speak more freely about this because you have that essay that's in the current issue.
Right. I mean, they did originally do that, but it was. Oh, sorry. Eat the mic again. It was a different type of magazine than Ellery Queen ended up being. It was more the novelization, which is the type of thing that a lot of the magazines at that time were doing. And really, there wasn't as much of a market for the short story per se. They were more focused on, we're going to put a novel in here, and they cut the novels just to pieces. It was not uncommon for them to have 20,000 words as a novel, meaning that they've cut 1 out of every 4 words. And so when you cut that much, you just lose something out of it. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of the magazines failed. But Mystery League didn't do that. They actually published the full, complete novels, which was just unheard of at the time.
I guess this would also be a good place to point out where Danae, as editor in particular, was really forward-thinking, and that's just because it's a few months ago, the end of last year, I was doing a lot of research into the first African-American writer who appeared in Ellery Queen's mystery magazine. His name was Hughes Allison, and that came together because Danae had been speaking at an MWA meeting in, I believe, 1947, and essentially said that he didn't believe that he could publish an African-American writer. And Allison, who was a playwright, he happened to be in the audience and challenged him to publish a detective story by a black writer. And in looking, the correspondence is not here, it's actually in Newark in Allison's archive. And the correspondence between him and Danae was really fascinating in terms of how they cooked up this project and what Allison was trying to do with this detective named Joe Hill, who he was partly modeling on Sherlock Holmes, but very much modeling on a real-life detective named Carlton B. Norris out in Newark, and how he put this story together called Corollary. And yet, the reason why Ellery Queen never published another story by Allison It Emerged is because there were so many complaints from the South.
Really?
So the fact that Danae had the courage to do it once is really interesting, and yet the market, I suppose, spoke in a really brutal and ugly way. But it didn't stop him from trying to be at the vanguard and be at the experiment. And I think maybe just talking a little bit about that in a general sense of how he and the magazine in particular really sort of pushed those boundaries.
Well, one of the things that always comes back to me when I think of the role that EQMM has played, it's easy to think of it from the point of view of an author and an editor. We're kind of a rarefied bunch. But what really came home to me when I was a child, and my first exposure to EQMM came this way. My parents were inveterate yard sailors. And we would go all over the East Coast, up and down the East Coast, but anytime we traveled anywhere else, we would go on yard sales, and every house in America had a cardboard box with old issues of Reader's Digest and Ellery Queen. And I mean every house. So when you talk about the bravery of putting something out in front of the public, you forget sometimes who the readers were. These were hundreds of thousands of people all over America. And this was a piece of mass market American entertainment in a way that very few websites today, very few magazines today are. You didn't see the New Yorker in those boxes, but you saw Ellery Queen. And I bought them for 25 cents a piece, and I ate. But that was everywhere. So when you put a black character in front of America, you were really putting a black character in front of all of America.
Right.
But they also did a very similar thing to it, the radio show. There was one episode that featured an African American cast, and same sort of thing happened. I got a collection of their letters, and wow, I was amazed. They had lots of them praised, but then they also had, and they were all from the South.
Yeah. Well, you would like to think that this is behind us, but in this election season, I'm afraid we can't say that.
No, and that's one of the reasons I brought this up, is that it is unfortunately and forever a timely and relevant thing to talk about. But I guess having addressed that, it's also a really good time to think about what Ellery Queen did, not just in terms of mystery set in America, and of course they published a lot by British writers, but they also were really, it was so critical of them to publish international stories. So I guess this is where I want to kind of seed it and have everybody else talk about it, so I don't, hog the panel here. But this, I mean, how much of your work is more on the international front too?
Well, the part that's really interesting for me is the way EQMM could respond so quickly to contemporary kind of social issues and questions, particularly during the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, since I'm so interested in the Cold War. EQMM published the first contemporary Russian detective story in English during the Cold War, I think in the early 60s by Lev Shinin. And it was paired with a Chekhov story. So it was put into this kind of literary historical context and then paired with, this actually wasn't one of the international or all nations issues, but it was kind of playing up the Iron Curtain at the same time as it was sort of taking it down and offering readers a look behind. So I think it's really interesting the way the magazine could respond so quickly to international issues and give more than just, a sort of black and white binary kind of perspective, the way a lot of dominant narratives in the U.S. at that time were trying to push.
Well, I'd be remiss too if I didn't talk about Anthony Boucher here, who,
Of course.
yes, who spoke many languages, and he was the one that many of these manuscripts were sent to. He would read through them in the original language and either divide them up into ones that he thought the magazine might be interested in, ones that didn't really fit the magazine's goals, and then if they were interested, then he went back and translated the stories.
Which languages did he speak or read?
Is it easier to say which ones he didn't?
Yeah, he spoke quite a few. I know French, Spanish. There were Sanskrit.
Sanskrit.
But I don't think
I'm sure the subscription, the submission file for Sanskrit was high, but
it was not.
Don Yates did a bunch of translation as well. I think Yates was the translator for Borges. And yet, can you imagine exposing an American readership to Garden of Forking Paths? This is not just an international author, but a difficult story, conceptually difficult story, and doing it without apology. Doing it out without dressing it up, without making it appear that you're eating your spinach. This, with all the enthusiasm of an ad man pitching a delicious frozen dinner. This is a great story. Read it. You're going to love it. And he pitched Cervantes the same way. Don Quixote detective. He took a chapter out of Don Quixote and said, "Here's a detective story."
And a second one called Sancho Panza Judge.
Yes, that's right. Because how can you get only one mystery story out of Don Quixote?
But it's true, I do like to bring up the Borges story to literary-minded folk who might not know about EQMM and say, see, he appeared here first.
Yeah, the three stories that work every time, without fail, are Borges appeared first in English in Ellery Queen. William Faulkner submitted a story and won second prize.
That was a whole other
lays them in the aisle.
To Manly Wade Wellman.
Yeah, Manly Wade Wellman, A Star for War. And
we should probably expound a little bit on that story for the entire audience.
Go ahead.
Well, I think I'll need everybody's help a little bit, but the way I've always remembered it and tell it is that Faulkner was so mad to lose out that he threatened to kill this guy. But I'd like to hear everybody else's version of this.
Part of this was that there was a contest that went on every year for the best story of the year, and so he looked at all the stories and the decision was made and they were published, and it was just, Faulkner was just amazed that anyone else could do better than him. How could that be?
Faulkner was also highly motivated by the very large first prize.
Yes, exactly.
So I think some of it may have also been economically motivated.
In fairness, it wasn't Faulkner's very best short story.
And in fairness, it was a lot of money.
And then the third story is Joyce Carol. So if you tell people how many stories Joyce Carol has written for Queen, that impresses them to no end. 26.
So you could do an entire omnibus just of Oates'
Yes.
Ellery Queen stories,
Yeah.
and it would sell remarkably well, I suspect, too.
I think that's probably true. So the literary presence is huge, but then you also look at the commercial writers who were either eager participants or dragged in kicking and screaming. I remember once when Eleanor Sullivan took over from Fred Danae after his death and tried to keep going all the traditions that Fred had taught her, and one of them was bringing these famous writers in, and she said she had one that I think Fred wanted to do but couldn't get the rights, and she never managed to get the rights. She managed to get T.S. Eliot, The Mystery Cat. She managed to get the poem McCavity, The Mystery Cat. But she wanted to get the rights to a song, and now maybe you can get it, a song by Rodgers and Hart called To Keep My Love Alive, which is about many methods of murder. And
Isn't it from Pal Joey?
I think so,
Yeah.
yes. And it's a wonderful song, and she wanted to print the lyrics as a sort of mammoth detective verse, and she could never get the rights. But so Rodgers and Hart never made an appearance, but all sorts of other major figures really did. And that made it fun to read. You never knew what would be around the corner. It was like a cameo appearance on an old talk show, like the Dean Martin show, and then who shows up? There's Frank Sinatra, and you think that's great. What a treat.
And to sort of go and expand a bit on what you were saying, Penny, that what really also made the magazine work weren't just the stories on their own, but how they were paired, the theme issues. The one I think of particularly, and this again goes back to the research that I've been doing the last few years, is when I was looking for a copy of Patricia Highsmith's very first story, The Heroine, even though it had been originally printed, I think, in Harper's Bazaar, won an O. Henry Prize. The edition that I found was one of the 1966 issues of EQMM. And what Danae had done is he had paired it alongside a Dolores Hitchens story called If You See This Woman, and he made it very clear in the introduction, the sort of joint introduction for both stories, how they sort of could play off of each other and what the similarities were and why it was important to read them together. And I'm wondering, do you guys think of other examples of pairings that might have seemed, say, counterintuitive, but when you looked at them together, they actually worked remarkably well?
Shakespeare and Poe actually were paired together because
Henry VI?
Yes, a doctoral student at Berkeley wrote a letter and said, you need to read these 250 lines or so. This is really the start of the sort of detective puzzle 250 years or so before Poe supposedly invented it. So it's really neat to see the letter with the sort of cutout piece from Shakespeare, and then in the context of the way Poe's mystery stories have worked.
There were all sorts of playful pairings that weren't even author pairings. I remember an issue in the 70s where there was a story called, if I'm remembering correctly, Every Litter Bit Helps. Somebody came up with that as a pun title. And another story called Every Litter Bit Hurts. That's a pairing. And now suddenly you're interested in reading both stories, when otherwise you wouldn't have been. The issues were curated. Every magazine is curated. Every magazine is the work of a conscious editorial mind choosing what goes there, but it was visibly curated. It was conspicuously curated. You heard the voice. It was almost like Stan Lee at Marvel Comics, where he had a certain voice, and you heard it on his editorial comments. Danae had a very similar approach, where there was a Danae voice, and you heard it.
I'm blanking on any particular...
Well, I think one other thing, too, to consider, and I talked about this a little bit already, is how hospitable EQMM was for women. I mean, you could find Patricia Highsmith, you could find Dolores Hitchens, Agatha Christie was a very regular contributor to the story. We've already mentioned Joyce Carol Oates. And I think that's just, again, a testament to how equal-minded Danae was. He was looking for mystery stories wherever and whoever happened to be writing them. And I feel like that sentiment needs to kind of be played up more, that somehow we need to keep reminding people why this magazine has lasted for so long and why the quality has persisted. And this is just what I keep coming back to. And sort of on a related tangent, aside from this being the 75th anniversary of the magazine, it's also the centennial of one of the magazine's most really important writers. They launched his career, and he wrote a story for them year after year after year. That's Stanley Ellen. So I feel like we should talk about him just as much too. I feel like to me he embodies Ellery Queen, and I wonder if that's something you agree with. Or...
Definitely. I mean, just in following the magazine and following him and how they kind of tie together just over the years is amazing. And to think that he was a first story, wasn't he?
Yep.
Yes.
So
Mystery of the House.
yes.
Featured in the current 75th anniversary
Yes,
issue.
and so I mean, just the fact that here's this major talent who really stars in the short form more than the longer form, and so I think he just really had a knack for finding these talents, and I don't know that there's very many places today where you could say someone is attracting this kind of a talent.
Ellen still has currency in weird places. I have found secret mystery fans by using the phrase "Lamb Amerstan," which is a reference to this story. And I'll be in a restaurant, and somebody will talk about Especially of the House, and I'll say, "Well, let's hope it's not Lamb Amerstan." And I can tell if they've read the story. So Ellen, he was brilliant. When you got to the Ellen story that year, it was like a Christmas present. It was like, oh, this is the issue. This is the one. And a lot of writers were like that. You get to the table of contents, you say, oh, good, there's a Jack Ritchie. It's like a little morsel. It's like you get a plate and there's a vegetable on it that you love, and you just eat it up. And it was, especially for a kid, maybe you hide your enthusiasms better when you're grown up. But for a kid, when you open this package, it really is like a care package. You're at camp and you open it up and look at all this variety of stuff you get to consume. It was wonderful.
This is a tough question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there a favorite Ellery Queen story that each of you has? And I'll go last because I'm evil.
Last may be hard. What if we pick yours?
No, you won't.
Okay. You mean not a story by the authors, Ellery Queen, or in the magazine?
No, in the magazine.
Okay. So many to choose from, but I'm going to say The Marked Man by David Eli. I'm probably going to get, my memory will you'll test this later, like on the debate, fact checkers, test me. Marked Man, a man is sent for survival training to Central Park, and he is told that you have to live off the land and you can't ask anyone for help, and to make sure he doesn't break the rules, they shave his head and paint his head green, so he's going to look peculiar, so he can't stop people, and he has to go in with survival tools, and he digs a hole under a boulder, and he lives under the boulder with a little device, and all he has is a device, and he can push a button. It has two buttons, and one button is I'm still here, everything's fine, and the other is emergency, come get me, and it lights a light when he pushes the button, and eventually, after weeks of living under this rock, he smashes open the box and looks inside and discovers it's not transmitting anything. It's just that the button is connected to the light, and he goes slowly mad over the course of this. It's a brilliant story.
I'm going to go big and say Ed Hoke.
All of that?
Oh, that's pretty big.
Yeah, it is. Just the fact that they had this relationship over the years that you were saying every year we got an Ellen story, but we got every issue. And just that relationship is just amazing to me. I've been transforming all these Ed Hoke books from Crippen and Landrew into ebooks, and I'm rereading all of these right now, and wow, I'm just reading book after book, and that's only a fraction of the stories he published with them.
I'm going to say Elaine Slater's The Suey Pill, which was a weird dystopian mystery, I think in 61. Where it's set in this horrible future, and everyone, when you turn 21, you get issued a suicide pill that you can then take whenever you want. But someone dies, so it's called the Suey Pill. Someone dies of accidental suey poisoning, so it's the investigation of that. That's the story, and it's just so odd.
And one I keep coming back to, and for some reason the title's eluding me at the moment, which is really annoying, but it's this Elsa Ann Gardner story that's so tiny and it's often anthologized, and it's just this person is alone in the house, and in that 500 word extract, everything suspenseful could possibly happen. And I remember just reading it and the hairs went up my neck, and I really wanted to reprint it for Troubled Daughters, and I couldn't find her.
Oh,
it was
no.
I found she was married. I know I could. It just didn't end up working out, as these things often happen. But I still just remember the creepy feeling that I had reading it, and I can see why.
Speaking of creepy feelings you have reading things, The Two Bottles of Relish by Lord Dunsany. If anyone has not read The Two Bottles of Relish by Lord Dunsany, I highly recommend it as a pairing with Specialty of the House. And another interesting category, which I think might particularly interest you, is the metafictional story. And of course, Forking Paths is an example. But I remember one called The Ooey Trap. which is impossible to pronounce for a reason. It's The Booby Trap with no B's. And it is a real-time story, first person if I recall correctly, about someone who has placed a bomb in a typewriter under the letter B, so that the victim, when the victim types and it hits the letter B, it'll blow up and kill the victim. And so the story's called The Ooey Trap because you can't type the letter B. And with spaces in the right places. And then you get through the story all the way to the end, and in the last word, the author types a word that you know would end with the letter B, and it ends just short of that. And so you realize that the author has blown herself up. That is great metafiction.
I also like all the William Brittain.
The Men Who Read.
Yes.
Yeah.
All the parodies, those are great.
Tell them about what that was.
So the first one I think was The Man Who Read John Nixon Carr. And it's a boy who becomes obsessed and reads for 10 years and is then going to do his own perfect locked room mystery. And he hopes that his story will be published, in fact, but not with any supernatural overtones, because he really didn't like that one. So all of his stories pick a famous fictional detective and kind of show the kind of a parody of what happens, I guess, when you read those stories obsessively, as so many of us do when we read mystery or detective fiction.
Right, so it's almost like the fan talking back. I mean, he's a professional writer, but the fan talking back to the authors that he admires. I remember the Men Who Read Isaac Asimov were a bunch of people who loved Isaac Asimov's Black Widowers puzzle stories, got together and tried to imitate the Black Widowers, which was great, which I then anthologized in the last collection of Black Widowers stories. I thought that it deserved to be there with the... I'm trying to think.
I did love the fact that the magazine not only went out of its way to publish parodies, but that the parodies themselves were just so much fun. I mean, when I was looking for an Elizabeth Sansay Holding, she of The Blank Wall, to publish, I really wanted to find one in Ellery Queen, but it turned out the only story that I could find that she had done was a Raymond Chandler parody, and it was not long before she died. It was fine, it just didn't quite fit with what I had in mind. And though it wasn't a parody, one of my other favorite EQMM pieces was by Lenore Glenn Offord, which was a poem, I believe it was called Memoirs of a Mystery Critic. And let's just say it felt very close to my own heart.
I can well imagine. The classic parody, of course, is Sherlock Holmes. Robert L. Fish wrote a whole series of Sherlock Holmes parodies that were of a very high order. And that set a bar very high for any subsequent writers to hit.
There's actually two, the James Holding stories. He wrote some of the Ellery Queen Jr. books, but then he also wrote a series of mysteries that appeared in the magazine that featured Manny and Fred as detectives. And so they're just vague enough that you sit there and you're puzzling over the story. Which one's Manny? Which one's Fred? And so they say one thing and you're like, oh, maybe that's, and then they say something else and you go back and forth. But it's really interesting that they have the original titles, that same form, the nationality, object, mystery. I
would love to see the acceptance letters for those stories, to see if it tripped out Fred and Manny.
I actually hope to have them soon.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Sorry, just checking on time. We're okay. I want to open up for questions.
Right, but I think this would be a good chance to kind of talk about EQMM in its more modern guise, as Janet is editing it, and what has changed and why not only has it persisted, but it's outlasted.
Yeah.
I mean, since I've been publishing stories, there was this whole ruckus online about online magazines are going to somehow upend what EQMM and Hitchcock were going to do. That didn't work, and it still isn't working. And I think it's just interesting to talk about why that is and why EQMM has the staying power and why it is, I believe, really necessary and important that it stick around.
Yeah, it's there's a long history of would-be competitors taking potshots at EQMM. Mm-hmm. That goes back to the print competitors that did it obnoxiously in the 60s, obnoxiously in the 70s, obnoxiously in the 80s. They're gone. Sometimes they did good work, but they didn't last. And one of the reasons, I think, is that they appealed to a specialized subset of the mystery reading population. It was only hard-boiled, or it was only British, or whatever it was. A lot of them were only hard-boiled, and I love hard-boiled. I publish a line of hard-boiled books. I don't want to read only hard-boiled. That's silly. And one of the things that has kept EQMM alive, I believe, is the variety of material that it contains. And then there's no way to quantify this, but honestly, the quality, and I'm not just saying that because you're sitting in front of me, but when you pick up an issue of EQMM, you have an expectation of high quality, and you don't get that satisfied by other magazines very often, or as consistently.
Well, I think one of the reasons it became so successful and then held on to that is the way the magazine has always kind of been almost a new technology or new interface. When it started, not only did it have these sort of new innovations that magazines like the Pulps were not doing, but it also created almost like the digital before the digital existed, in that it did. You had a real kind of two-way communication happening, or three-way communication between writers and editors and readers. So you do see readers' letters. The editors would ask readers, hey, we're thinking of changing the cover. Here's an example. What do you think? Or write in for the title of this story. Or, they would do the riddle stories where the ending is omitted and readers have to. So it's always been this kind of interactive, very portable sort of technology that remained compelling without having to use the same kind of tools of sensationalism that the Pulps used or that movies and TV were using. So it wasn't exactly competing the same way, I think.
I always, when I'm talking about the magazine, I compare the magazine to BoucherCon.
How so?
BoucherCon is the conference where all the mystery writers go to. We all play well together, and there's a wonderful time had by all. There's lots of regional conferences. There's lots of topic-related conferences. You have Mouse Domestic, you have Thriller Fest, you have all of those. But BoucherCon is the one where they all fit together and play well together, and that just to me is like the magazine. You have the other magazines that have a particular area that they're interested in, but Ellery Queen just publishes them all and they all get along together.
And the fact that an issue could conceivably have, and I'm mixing my times here, but the fact that it could conceivably have a story by Lillian Jackson Braun, because she did publish her first cat mysteries in Ellery Queen, alongside a Joyce Carol Oates story, alongside a Jeffrey Deaver story, alongside an Ellen or a Jack Ritchie story or a Hilary Davidson story. The fact that you can have this wide breadth of what the mystery genre is, month after month, year after year. I mean, that's really remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's self-perpetuating to some extent. No competitor can buy history. No competitor can acquire reputation. To some extent, Ellery Queen is exciting to read because Ellery Queen has been exciting to read for decades and decades.
But that doesn't mean it's resting on its laurels.
No. No, far from it. No, you talk about interaction. There's been the Readers' Award now for many years, and that makes readers feel like participants, not just people who are passive recipients of
And of course now there actually is a digital element with the forums and the electronic sort of digital subscriptions and things like that as well.
And Passport to Crime has revived the importance of the international element, and there are all sorts of. It's funny to see society through the lens of Ellery Queen. I mean, in a very small way. If you go to the 70s issues, you find disco first show up. If you go to modern issues, you find instant messaging show up in stories. So you can chronicle the history of American society through the pages of Ellery Queen. What becomes a gimmick or a clue for a murder mystery? I remember a story that hinged on a blind character. You can date this story without my telling you. A blind character who only accepted quarters. He was sort of a peculiar guy who lived on the street, and he would ask for change, and you could only shut him up if you gave him a quarter. And some bad guy wanted him to be quiet, handed him a quarter in the dark, and instead, by accident, handed him a Susan B. Anthony dollar. And so he kept shouting, and the guy got caught. There was 1 year in American history that story would have been written, and only one. But Ellery Queen has spanned all those years, so you can find every little bit of American culture, pop culture, and high culture in there.
including superhero stories in the 50s when Batman first. I think it's called Mr. Lightning in 1950 something.
What? It was about a superhero? I don't know how I missed that.
Yeah.
I was fascinated.
Well, if you look at the covers, you can find what issue it is real quick, because it says the cover actually advertises, for fans of Batman, check out our new story on. So, and of course,
That's great.
So I think it's amazing the way you can kind of track when comic books or TV. They've got Steve Allen show mystery and paired with a story by Steve Allen.
Right.
So I think you're right that you can definitely kind of track these major cultural kind of interests through the magazine.
So we're going to throw it open to you guys to the extent that you have questions. To the extent that you don't, we will keep yammering very happily.
Yes.
I see. There's.
Actually, I'm going to bring the microphone.
Oh, excellent. Other people would call this the Oprah approach, but I'm old enough to call it the Donahue approach.
Well, I can project my
It's coming anyway.
It's coming anyway.
Okay. These are more comments than questions, but just to elaborate. Sarah, the story by Elson Ann Gardner, was Y-O.
I thought it was, but for some reason I couldn't commit to being wrong. That's on me. Thank you.
Well, I did prepare her first one tonight with the boys. And next to you, Mr. Lightning. This goes back to what one of you was saying, William Brattan. That was William Brattan's story.
Oh, terrific.
Okay.
Published under a pseudonym because it wasn't one of his man who read stories.
That's great.
Thank you.
And for
Jeffrey.
Herrings, just look at 3 stories. This was my favorite. The author by Ed Hoke, teaching you first a who done it, then a why done it, then a how done it.
Right.
A youngster trying to learn the differences, it was perfect.
That was great.
He wrote all.
Didn't they also do at one point during the bicentennial a centennial story, a bicentennial story, and a tricentennial story by Isaac Asimov set in the future?
sounds
I think so. One set in colonial era, one set in modern day at the time 1976, and one set in 2076.
Yeah, I was reading the diary of Horace Gregory's wife, Maria Zaratevska, the poetess who won the Pulitzer Prize. 1941. She's up at the McDowell Colony, and a crime writer with the initials PH, which has got to be Patricia Highsmith.
If it's a nasty story, it's going to be PH.
She's so full of herself, it's all me, but that's not the question I have. She is a crime writer, not necessarily a mystery writer, because what's happening is a crime. On the other hand, not every mystery has to be a crime involved, if I'm correct.
Sure.
But every crime has a crime. So, in terms of that, who would you say? Obviously, Sherlock Holmes is both, but that's the greatest of the great. He's a mystery and a crime. But how would you break that down? What do you think the percentages are in popular writing? Is it always a crime, or is it a mystery? Is it only a crime? Like the guy with the rock is not a crime. That's a mystery.
There are a lot of books that are crime stories that aren't mystery stories, where you're not trying to solve the mystery. That's very common. It's a heist story. Ocean's 11 isn't a whodunit. You have lots of crime stories that aren't mysteries. You have mystery stories that aren't crime stories, but those generally get shelved under literature. All of life is a mystery. So there probably are mystery stories that we would call mysteries that don't have a crime in them. I can think of the very first Black Widower story by Isaac Asimov called The Acquisitive Chuckle, has no crime in it. It's a man who thinks something was stolen from him, but he can't think what it was because his home is full of tchotchkes. And he knows that someone stole something, but he doesn't know what was stolen because he can't tell that anything was missing. And in the end, I'm going to spoil an old story. What was stolen was his peace of mind.
I guess it is instructive that certainly in the early editions of EQMM, they would separate out what the mystery stories were from the crime stories is. And certainly for my own purposes, I was checking the crime subcategory a little bit more because that's where the more psychological suspense stories could be found. But I do think in contemporary stories and certainly contemporary novels, the way that mystery, suspense, thriller, crime all blurs together. It's more just what publishers think will appeal to a wide audience versus what they will think they will appeal to a narrow audience. And that keeps changing depending on what happens to break out and do incredibly well, and suddenly they make a category out of it, and then we all start over again. But that's a subject for another symposium.
Any other questions?
Yeah, there was.
Yeah, excellent.
I guess that was sort of leading to my question. I don't know if we want to answer this symposium or not, but now that the magazine is 75 years old, are we thinking about the next 25 years?
I think, Janet, you need to come up.
Yeah, that's part of the question for Janet.
I think we need more Sarah Weinman stories, clearly.
Gosh, that's an awfully big question.
Well, we start early with the big questions, you know.
I plan to say a few words at the end about why I think the magazine is so needed and why it's so needs serious interest. But of course, will be the thing that you've touched on today is the thing that I think is most important. The great power with which Fred Dene endowed this magazine was its variety, its reach, this incredible expanse of material that he included in the magazine. It's what I think is the most important thing about the magazine, and it's certainly what I intend to try to continue, and I hope any subsequent editor will continue.
If I may chime in, one of the things that I feel is sort of really important for me to do is to tell my crime writer friends of my age, or especially younger, why it is important for them to submit to Ellery Queen and to Hitchcock, because I feel like they don't think about it as much as a place where stories of quality, of literary merit have a place, when in fact that's exactly why they should be there. And it feels just really important to keep stressing that there is a home for all sorts of great stories, but you're not going to know about them if people aren't going to submit them.
Yeah, if you don't read the magazine, you're not going to think to submit to the magazine. So the first step I always take is telling people to read the magazine.
And to subscribe.
And I just admitted to Janet earlier today that I hadn't subscribed for years, but I finally subscribed, and it just dawned on me. I don't know why it dawned on me. It's much more fun to walk into the office and pick up a free copy. That's great. But, but I thought, well, why am I not supporting this? So I am now a proud card-carrying subscriber, and I hope that all of you, when you go home, will fill out the little card, stick it in the mail, and subscribe. It's a delicious, wonderful read. I know I don't have to tell any of you you're here, but I bet there are people in this room who haven't bought a copy in a long time. Go buy a copy. Buy two.
Are there any more questions out there?
Yes,
Otto, come on.
Actually, since you're trying to fill, and there were no questions, I just have a little story, if I might. Since you brought up the great Stanley Ellen and his first story, The Specialty of the House. Stan, the way that story came about, Stan was in the Army, and he and his wife were running a chicken farm in upstate New York. And when he came out of the Army, he said, I want to write for a living. And his wife said, okay, I'll give you a year. And he wrote and wrote and was rejected and rejected. But they had enough, there was some sort of anniversary coming up that they were celebrating, and they had enough, what do you call it, after the war, you had rations.
Yeah.
And they had enough meat to go out to a dinner and have steak. And they went to a restaurant and they ordered steaks. And the waiter took the order and went away and never came back. And finally, their patience exhausted, they asked for, what was happening. And there was no explanation. But a few minutes later,
their steaks arrived.
And he went home, and that was his idea. And it was the day before his year was up that he got the letter from Fred saying, "We've accepted your story."
That's great.
Nice story.
Thank you. So, Ellery Queen, we're going to finish with one last thought apiece on the magazine, not the author of the magazine. When was the first time you read it? What's your earliest strong memory?
Oh gosh, certainly college. I feel like I have to admit I didn't really read it seriously until I started writing and thinking I need to get my writing chops up to be able to submit a story because I need it to count and I don't want to have to go through a mess of rejections. And I would just like to add, one of the things that really impresses upon me is that I trust Janet as a reader, but I also don't try to send her stuff that I don't think is up to quality. But I'm very grateful when she gives me rejections because it makes me a better writer. And I think having that kind of editorial input and relationship is hugely important. So I feel like I approach EQMM not just as a reader, but also as a writer, and the both sort of work in concert.
I came to EQMM much more recently, but I came to the old issues. I came to it when I was working on this project with detective fiction and postmodern literature, and I spent 2 days from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. in the archives just reading EQMM one issue after the other because I was so excited to find all of this amazing stuff that I didn't think even was happening as early as the 1940s. So for me, I was just kind of instantly enthralled.
I'm going to tell everyone that I started way before any of these people. I think it's just because I'm older, but I started back in the 70s, and there was a period of time where I had just discovered mystery, and I would wait patiently every month to go up, and my parents were saints, I think, because they'd drive me up every month, and I'd pick up my copy. And
where did you have to go?
I was a local bookstore,
okay.
But still, it wasn't very far, but I wasn't driving it. And I just loved the magazine, and the magazine then turned me on to many authors, and then I started reading all those authors, and it just kind of spread from there. So, I mean, really, it's one of the big parts of me becoming a huge fan of the entire genre is I was introduced to so many different authors from that genre.
I started in the 70s also. I'm probably as old as you are. And I have all sorts of strong memories of discovering authors and so forth, but my proudest moment, although a close second was having a story accepted by Eleanor Sullivan to appear in the Department of First Stories, that is my second proudest moment. My proudest moment was one day when Isaac Asimov, who had still has a sister magazine published by the same company, Isaac Asimov Science Fiction Magazine, he would come in every Tuesday. And we would talk a little bit. I was a teenager, I was an intern there, but I loved his science fiction, and I loved his Black Widower stories, and I would nag him and bother him until he would make me go away. And one day he came in and dropped off a manuscript with Eleanor of a new Black Widower story. He said, I made a copy for you. I know you like the Black Widower stories. Why don't you read this one? I said, that's great, thank you so much, that's wonderful. And I put it away, on my desk to read later. I said, no, read it. And I read it, and it was about this sort of obnoxious, young writer with a long chin who was the guest at the Black Widows. And I thought, now I have arrived. I am a character in a story. And that felt so good.
Nothing will ever compare, right?
Nothing will ever compare. So with that, I thank you for letting us kick off the event.
Thank you, Charles and Jeff and Pat.
Thank you.
And Leah.
All right, we'll move right into our next panel. So, and we'll have a break.
It's such a pleasure.
This podcast was recorded and edited by Ché Ryback. Mixing for the podcast was done by Jackie Sherbo. You can subscribe to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine by visiting our website at www.themysteryplace.com/EQMM.